On today's episode of The Great Gatsby, Nick is invited to a party at Tom and Myrtle's apartment. He meets some of their other guests and they have some drinks as well.
The apartment was on the top floor. It had a small living room, small dining room, and a bath. The only picture in the living room was an over-enlarged photograph, apparently a hen sitting on a blurred rock. Mrs. Wilson was first concerned with the dog. An elevator boy went for a box full of straw and some milk, to which he added a tin of large, hard dog biscuits. Meanwhile, Tom brought out a bottle of whiskey from a locked bureau door. Now, I've only been drunk twice in my life, and the second time was that afternoon. Myrtle sat on Tom's lap, and she began calling some friends on the telephone, asking them to come over for a party. I noticed there were no cigarettes, so I went to the drugstore on the corner to buy some. When I returned, Tom and Myrtle had disappeared. Not too soon after, they returned along with some of their friends and guests, one of whom was Myrtle's sister, Catherine. When she moved around, her bracelets jingled up and down her arms. Chester McKee was a pale, feminine man from the apartment below. His wife was a shrill, languid, handsome, and horrible.
My dear, most of these fellas will cheat you every time. All they think of is money. I had a woman up here last week to look at my feet, and when she gave me the bill, you thought she had my appendicitis out.
She then told her sister,
I like your dress. I think it's adorable. Just a crazy old thing. I just slip it on sometimes when I don't care what I look like. But it looks wonderful on you, if you know what I mean. If Chester could only get you in that pose, I think he could make something of it.
We all looked in silence at Myrtle, who removed a strand of hair over her eyes and looked back at us with a brilliant smile. Mr. McKee regarded her intently with his head on one side and then moved his hand back and forth slowly in front of his face.
I should change the light. I'd like to bring out the modeling of the features, and I'd try to get a hold of the back hair.
I wouldn't think of changing the light. I think it's...
Mr. McKee interrupted her. Tom yawned audibly and got to his feet.
You McKees have something to drink. Get some more ice and mineral water, Myrtle, before everyone goes to sleep.
I told that boy about the ice. These people! You have to keep them after all the time.
She looked at me, followed by pointless laughter. Then she walked to the dog, kissed it on the head, and went to the kitchen as if a dozen chefs awaited her orders there.
I've done some nice things out on Long Island. 2 of them we have framed downstairs.
2 what?
2 studies. One of them I called Mountic Point, the goals, and the other I called Mountic Point, the sea.
Catherine turned towards Nick, both sitting on the couch.
Do you live down on the Long Island too?
I live at West Egg.
Really? I was down there at a party about a month ago, at a man named Gatsby's house. Do you know him?
I live next door to him, actually.
Well, they say he's a nephew or a cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm's. That's where all his money comes from.
Really?
I'm scared of him. I'd hate to have him get anything on me.
This information about my neighbor was interrupted by Mrs. McKee pointing suddenly at Catherine.
Chester, I think you could do something with her.
Mr. McKee nodded in a boring way and turned his attention to Tom.
I'd like to do more work on Long Island if I could get that entry. All I ask is that they should give me some.
Ask Myrtle. She'll give you a letter of introduction. Won't you, Myrtle?
Do what?
You'll give Mr. McKee a letter of introduction to your husband, so he can do some studies on it.
His lips moved silently for a moment as he worded out George B. Wilson at the gasoline pump, or something like that. Catherine then leaned close to me and whispered into my ear.
Neither of them can stand the person they're married to.
Can't they?
Can't stand them? Why I say in this, why go in the living room with them if they can't stand them? If I was them, I'd divorce and get married to each other right away.
She doesn't like Wilson either? The answer to this was unexpected. Myrtle had overheard this question, and her response was violent and obscene.
You see, it's really his wife that's keeping them apart. She's a Catholic, and they don't believe in divorces.
Daisy was not a Catholic, and I was a little shocked at the elaborateness of the life.
When they do get married, they're going west to live for a while until it blows over. It'd be more discreet to go to Europe. Oh, do you like Europe? She exclaimed. I just got back from Monte Carlo. Really? Just last year I went up there with another girl. Stay long? No, we just went to Monte Carlo and back. We went of Marseilles. We had over $1,200 when we started, but we got gypped out of it all in 2 days in the private rooms. We had an awful time getting back, I can tell you. God, how I hated that town.
The shrill voice of Mrs. McKee called me back into the room.
I almost made a mistake too, she declared vigorously. I almost married a little kike who had been after me for years. I knew he was below me. Everyone kept saying to me, Lucille, that man's way below you. But if I hadn't met Chester, he'd have got me for sure. Yes, but listen.
Nods her head.
At least you didn't marry him. I know I didn't. Well, I married him. And that's the difference between your case and mine. Why did you, Myrtle? Nobody forced you to. I married him because I thought he was a gentleman. I thought he knew something about breeding, but he wasn't fit to lick my shoe. You were crazy about him for a while.
Crazy about him? Who said I was crazy about him? I never was about that man there.
She pointed at me. Everyone looked at me accusingly. I tried to show by my expression that I played no part in her past.
The only crazy I was when I was married him. I knew right away I made a mistake. He borrowed somebody's best suit to get married in, and never even told me about it. And the man came after it one day when he was out.
She looked around to see who was listening. Oh, is that your suit? I said.
This is the first I ever heard about it, but I gave it to him, and then I lay down and cried to the beat of the band all night. She really ought to get away from him.
Resumed Catherine to me.
They've been living over that garage for 11 years, and Tom's the first sweetie she ever had.
The bottle of whiskey, a second one, was now in constant demand by all present, expecting Catherine, who felt just as good on nothing at all. Tom rang for the janitor and sent him for some celebrated sandwiches, which were a complete supper in themselves. I wanted to get out and walk eastward toward the park through the soft twilight, but each time I tried to go, I became entangled in some wild, strident argument which pulled me back, as if with ropes, into my chair. Yet high over the city, our line of yellow windows must have contributed their share of human secrecy to the casual watcher in the darkening streets, and I was him too, looking up and wondering.
As the plot thickens, we will take a commercial break. We will be right back with The Great Gatsby after these important announcements.
Introducing the Ford 4-cylinder, 20-horsepower, 5-passenger touring car. Starting at $850, you are guaranteed that this automobile, built by Ford workers in Detroit, is built to last. Delivery begins October 1st. You can get a test drive at your local Ford branch store today.
This weekend only, come on down to the Bronx at the Yankee Stadium for the grudge match of the century between the New York Yankees and the Boston Red Sox. Ticket prices start at 25 cents with bleacher seats, or if you like the good action, grandstand seats are just $1.10. Get your peanuts and your Cracker Jacks and let's play ball! And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
I was within and without, simultaneously enchanted and repelled by the inexhaustible variety of life. Myrtle pulled her chair closer to mine, and suddenly her warm breath poured over me the story of her first meeting with Tom.
It was on the two little seats facing each other that are always the last ones left on the train. I was going up to New York to see my sister and spend the night. He had on a dress suit and patent leather shoes, and I couldn't keep my eyes off him. But every time he looked at me, I had to pretend to be looking at the advertisement over his head. When we came to the station, he was next to me, in his white shirt front pressed against my arm, and so I told him I'd have to call a policeman, but he knew I lied. I was so excited that when I got into the taxi with him, I didn't hardly know I was getting into the subway train. All I could think about, over and over, was, you can't live forever, you can't live forever.
She turned to Mrs. McKee, and the room rang full of her artificial laughter.
My dear, I'm going to have to give you this dress as soon as I'm through with it. I've got to get another one tomorrow. I'm going to make a list of all the things I need to get. A massage, and a wave, and a collar for the dog, and one of those cute little ashtrays where you touch a spring and a wreath, with a black silk bow for a mother's grave. That'll last all summer. I gotta write down a list so I won't forget all these things I gotta do.
It was 9 o'clock. Almost immediately afterward, I looked at my watch and found it was 10. Mr. McKee was asleep on a chair with his fists clenched in his lap, like a photograph of a man of action. Taking out my handkerchief, I wiped from his cheek that remains of the spot of fine lather that worried me all the afternoon. The little dog was sitting on the table looking with blind eyes through the smoke, and from time to time groaning faintly. People disappeared, reappeared, made plans to go somewhere, and then lost each other, searched for each other, found each other a few feet away. Sometime after toward midnight, Tom Buchanan and Mrs. Wilson stood face to face discussing, in impassioned voices, whether Mrs. Wilson had any right to mention Daisy's name.
Daisy, 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 Daisy,
Shouted Mrs. Wilson.
I'll say it whenever I want to. Daisy, Daisy.
Making a short, deft movement, Tom Buchanan broke her nose with his open hand. Then there were bloody towels upon the bathroom floor, and women's voices scolding, and high over the confusion a long broken wail of pain. Mr. McKee awoke from his doze and started in a daze toward the door. When he had gone halfway, he turned around and stared at the scene. His wife and Catherine scolding and consoling as they stumbled here and there among the crowded furniture with articles of aid, and the despairing figure on the couch, bleeding fluently, and trying to spread a copy of Town Tattle over the tapestry scenes of Versailles. Then Mr. McKee turned and continued on out the door. Taking my hat from the chandelier, I followed.
Come to lunch someday.
He suggested as we groaned down in the elevator. Where?
Anywhere.
Keep your hands off the lever.
Snapped the elevator boy.
I beg your pardon.
Said Mr. McKee with dignity.
I didn't know I was touching it.
All right, I agreed. I'll be glad to. I was standing beside his bed as he was sitting up between the sheets, clad in his underwear, with a great portfolio in his hand. It said Beauty and the Beast, Loneliness, Old Grocery Horse, Brooklyn Bridge. Then I was lying half asleep in the cold lower level of the Pennsylvania station, staring at the Morning Tribune and waiting for the 4 o'clock train.
A riveting story. Tune in next week for part 3 of The Great Gatsby, brought to you by your local radio station. Have a good night, folks.